Bill Henderson's weathered hands froze on the sanctuary gate latch, his 68-year-old frame going rigid as he stared into the flooded enclosure. The coffee mug slipped from his grasp, shattering against concrete. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Lions don't reach out to humans like that. Maggie Stone screamed from behind him, her clipboard clattering to the ground as she stumbled backward. The other volunteers scattered, cell phones already recording what would become the most viral animal video in internet history. But Bill saw something else in that massive lion's amber eye. The same desperate plea he'd seen in his son's photograph from Afghanistan, the one that arrived 3 days before the telegram. The same look Martha had given him in those final hospital moments. "Get the tranquilizer gun!" Maggie shouted, her voice cracking with terror and disbelief. Yet Bill stepped forward instead, every instinct screaming against what he was about to do. What had driven this apex predator to seek help from the very species that had broken him? And why did Bill feel like his entire life had led to this impossible moment? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Bill Henderson had never intended to find salvation in a place that smelled of hay and heartbreak. The Lone Star Wildlife Sanctuary sat on 43 acres of Texas hill country, where the morning mist clung to mesquite trees like the ghosts of better days. He'd been volunteering here for 8 months now, ever since the silence in his empty house became too loud to bear. "You're early again?" Maggie Stone observed, watching him unlock the supply shed with military precision at 5:30 in the morning. At 62, she carried herself with the weary grace of someone who'd spent 3 decades rescuing the unwanted and forgotten. Her husband Tom had built this sanctuary with his own hands before his heart gave out 2 years ago, leaving her to carry on their shared dream alone. "Sleep's overrated," Bill muttered, shouldering a 50-pound feed bag with the ease of a man who'd spent 40 years in the Army Veterinary Corps. The familiar weight felt good against his back, a reminder that his body still had purpose, even if his soul felt hollow. The sanctuary housed 23 animals, each with a story that would break your heart if you let it. There was Bella, the arthritic black bear rescued from a roadside zoo in Oklahoma. Thunder, the one-eyed eagle who'd lost his wing to a power line. And then there was Courage. Bill had named the lion himself, though Maggie insisted it was presumptuous. Animals name themselves through their actions, she'd argued. But Bill saw something in that massive cat that reminded him of the soldiers he'd treated in field hospitals from Vietnam to Afghanistan, broken but not beaten, scarred but still fighting. Courage had arrived 6 months ago from a bankrupt circus in Mexico, where he'd spent 8 years in a cage barely large enough for a German shepherd. The abuse had left him blind in his left eye, his ribs showing through dull golden fur, and his spirit shattered into fragments. Most days he huddled in the far corner of his enclosure, flinching at sudden sounds and refusing to eat if anyone was watching. "He's making progress," Maggie had insisted just last week, though Bill could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes. The sanctuary was hemorrhaging money faster than a combat medic could stop arterial bleeding. Insurance companies balked at covering exotic animals. Donations had dried up since the economy tanked, and the city council was making noises about public safety concerns. Bill understood the mathematics of survival better than most. His own house, the one he'd shared with Martha for 37 years, sat empty except for memories and medical bills. The life insurance had covered her cancer treatments, but not the hole she'd left behind. Their son James had been gone even longer, killed by an IED outside Kandahar 3 years ago. At 68, Bill Henderson was learning that surviving your family was a special kind of hell that no military training could prepare you for. But here, among the broken and forgotten, he'd found something resembling peace. Until this morning, when everything changed. The first sign of trouble came at dawn when Bill noticed the creek running higher than usual. By the time he finished his coffee, muddy water was lapping at the sanctuary's lower fencing. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts about the Pedernales Dam failure 30 miles upstream, sending a wall of water toward the hill country that hadn't seen flooding like this since 1998. "We need to move the animals to higher ground," Maggie announced, her voice cutting through the morning chaos as volunteers scrambled to implement the emergency evacuation plan they'd hoped never to use. "Start with the smaller enclosures first." Bill grabbed his veterinary kit and headed for the big cats, his boots splashing through puddles that were growing larger by the minute. Thunder, the eagle, was already secured in a transport carrier, his one good eye alert but calm. Bella, the bear, had been coaxed into her traveling crate with honey-soaked apples. But as Bill approached Courage's enclosure, his heart sank. The lion's habitat sat in a natural depression that had seemed perfect for drainage during construction. Now it was rapidly becoming a death trap. Brown water swirled around the base of the climbing structure, already 3 feet deep and rising fast. Courage perched on a concrete platform barely 6 inches above the waterline, his massive frame trembling with something Bill recognized all too well, the particular terror of being trapped with no escape route. "How long before it reaches his platform?" Bill called to Maggie, who was coordinating the evacuation from the main gate. She splashed over, took one look at the situation, and her face went pale. 20 minutes, maybe less. The water's rising faster than the Weather Service predicted. They'd drilled for this scenario, but the plan assumed they'd have hours, not minutes. The tranquilizer dart took 15 minutes to take effect, and moving an unconscious 400-pound lion required specialized equipment they couldn't get into position in time. The emergency crane was stuck at the main road, blocked by fallen trees and debris. "We could try to guide him out through the access gate," suggested Miguel, one of the younger volunteers, pointing to the narrow entrance designed for feeding and cleaning. "If we open it and create a corridor." "He won't move," Bill said quietly, watching Courage's body language. The lion's ears were flattened against his skull, his breathing rapid and shallow. "Look at him. He's in full panic mode, trauma response. He's frozen." This was the cruel irony of rescuing abused animals. The very instincts that might save them in the wild had been broken by human cruelty. A healthy lion would have climbed, swum, or fought his way to safety. But Courage had learned that movement brought pain, that trusting his instincts led to beatings. Now, when he needed those instincts most, they'd abandoned him. The water rose another inch. "Bill, we have to try the dart gun," Maggie said, though her voice carried no conviction. "If we don't act now, he'll drown before the drugs take effect." Bill was already shrugging out of his jacket, his hands moving to his bootlaces with the mechanical precision of a man who'd made life-or-death decisions in field hospitals from Saigon to Kabul. "How deep is it at the platform?" "Bill, no." Maggie's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 3 decades managing dangerous animals. "Absolutely not. He's a traumatized predator in panic mode. He'll kill you without even thinking about it." "Maybe." Bill tested the water temperature with his hand, cold enough to shock the system, warm enough not to cause immediate hypothermia. "But he's also a fellow soldier who's trapped behind enemy lines, and we don't leave our people behind." The comparison wasn't lost on anyone present. They'd all heard Bill talk about courage in military terms, the way he spoke about the lion's tour of duty in the circus, his combat stress, his need for rehabilitation. Now that metaphor was about to become literally life or death. "There has to be another way," Miguel protested. But even as he spoke, they could all see the water creeping higher. Courage was now standing rather than lying down, his massive paws gripping the edge of the platform as the concrete grew slick with spray. Bill stripped down to his undershirt and jeans, his 68-year-old body still carrying the lean muscle of a lifetime military man. though arthritis had stiffened his joints and old injuries ached in the cold. The scars on his arms told stories of surgeries performed under fire, of patients saved and lost in places most people couldn't pronounce. "If I don't make it out," he said, handing Maggie his wallet and keys, "my will's in the kitchen drawer. Everything goes to the sanctuary. Tell Martha and James I'll see them soon." "Bill, please." But he was already in the water, the shock of cold driving the breath from his lungs as he waded toward the center of the enclosure. The current was stronger than it looked from outside, tugging at his legs with insistent fingers that promised to drag him downstream if he lost his footing. Courage saw him coming and let out a sound Bill had never heard before, not a roar, not a growl, but something between a whimper and a question. The lion's good eye tracked his movement, ears swiveling forward in what might have been curiosity or might have been the predatory focus that preceded an attack. "Easy there, soldier," Bill said in the same tone he'd used with wounded Marines in triage tents, calm and steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I'm coming to get you out of this mess." The water was chest deep now, forcing Bill to half swim, half wade as he approached the platform. Courage backed to the far edge, muscles coiled with tension, but he didn't attack. Instead, he continued making that soft, questioning sound, his massive head tilted as if trying to understand why this human was approaching instead of fleeing. "That's right, big guy. Just you and me figuring this out together." Bill reached the platform and carefully placed his hands on the concrete edge, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Now, I know you've got good reasons not to trust people, but right now I'm the only taxi service in this neighborhood." The water level was now lapping at the platform surface. In less than 5 minutes, there would be no dry ground left in the enclosure. Bill could hear Maggie shouting instructions to the other volunteers, coordinating the evacuation of the remaining animals, but her voice seemed to come from another world. This world consisted only of cold water, rising panic, and 800 pounds of apex predator, deciding whether to trust the man who'd just volunteered to die for him. "What do you say, Courage?" Bill extended his hand slowly, palm up, the same gesture he'd used to calm frightened horses in cavalry units 4 decades ago. "Ready to get out of here." What happened next defied every principle of animal behavior Bill had learned in 4 decades of veterinary practice. Instead of attacking or fleeing, Courage stepped forward and gently placed his massive paw into Bill's outstretched palm. The contact lasted exactly 7 seconds. Bill would know because Maggie counted them aloud from the fence, her voice shaking with disbelief. 7 seconds of rough pads against weathered skin, of amber eyes meeting blue ones in what could only be described as mutual recognition. Then the lion withdrew his paw and positioned himself at the edge of the platform, as if waiting for instruction. "Holy Mother of God," whispered Miguel, his phone already recording what would become the most shared animal video in internet history. "Did that just happen?" Bill felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since James's last phone call from Afghanistan. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight of survivor's guilt lifted just enough for him to breathe. This broken lion had just chosen to trust him, not because he had to, but because something in that damaged heart recognized a kindred spirit. "All right, soldier," Bill said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Time to move out." He guided Courage into the water with the same patience he'd once used to coax shell-shocked Marines out of bunkers. The lion entered reluctantly, his massive body tense with remembered trauma, but he stayed close to Bill's side as they began the treacherous journey toward higher ground. The current was brutal, constantly threatening to separate them or sweep them both downstream toward the concrete spillway that would mean certain death. Courage, despite his size and strength, was clearly struggling. Years of malnutrition and confinement had left him with little stamina, and the cold water sapped what energy he had. Halfway across the enclosure, Bill felt the lion faltering. Courage's breathing became labored, his powerful strokes growing erratic. Without thinking, Bill wrapped his arm around the cat's massive chest, using his own body as a flotation device while kicking hard toward the fence line where Maggie and the volunteers waited. "I've got you," he gasped, tasting muddy water as waves lapped over his face. "We're gonna make it. Both of us." The rescue took 23 minutes from start to finish, though it felt like hours. By the time they reached the fence, both man and lion were exhausted beyond measure. Courage collapsed on the muddy ground, his sides heaving, while Bill lay beside him in a similar state of depletion. That's when it happened. The moment that would make believers out of skeptics and change both their lives forever. As Bill struggled to catch his breath, Courage lifted his massive head and looked directly at him. Then, with deliberate intention, the lion reached out and placed his paw on Bill's chest, directly over his heart. The gesture was unmistakably protective, possessive even, as if the animal was claiming this human as his own. "Jesus Christ on a cracker," Maggie breathed, her usual composure cracking completely. "In 30 years of wildlife rescue, I have never seen anything like that." The volunteers stood in stunned silence, phones capturing every second of the impossible tableau. Miguel's hand shook so badly he could barely hold his camera steady. Even the other animals seemed to sense something extraordinary was happening. The usual cacophony of sanctuary sounds had fallen to an eerie quiet. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the sanctuary's consulting veterinarian, arrived just as Courage was establishing his protective vigil over Bill. A woman who'd built her reputation on scientific objectivity and evidence-based animal behavior, she found herself witnessing something that challenged everything she thought she knew about interspecies relationships. "This is unprecedented," she murmured, pulling out her own phone to document what she was seeing. "Lions don't form attachment bonds with humans like this. It goes against every established behavioral pattern." But the evidence was literally lying before them. Courage had positioned himself so that Bill was completely shielded from the other humans, his massive body creating a barrier that said as clearly as words, "This one is mine. I protect him now." "What do we do?" asked Miguel, still filming. "I mean, how do we separate them? Bill needs medical attention, and that lion needs to be checked for hypothermia." It was a valid concern. Both man and animal showed signs of exposure, blue lips, shallow breathing, the telltale shivering that indicated their core temperatures had dropped dangerously low. But every time someone approached, Courage would tense, ready to defend his chosen human. "Let me try," Maggie said, approaching slowly with her hands visible and empty. "Courage, you did good, baby. You saved each other. But now, we need to make sure you're both okay." The lion watched her with his one good eye, muscles coiled with potential violence. But when Bill stirred and spoke, "It's all right, soldier. These are friendlies," Courage relaxed enough to allow the humans to approach. Dr. Mitchell's examination revealed what they'd all feared. Both man and lion were suffering from mild hypothermia and exhaustion. But more importantly, she confirmed what everyone had witnessed. Courage was displaying protective behavior that had no precedent in the scientific literature. "This attachment could be trauma-based," she explained as they moved both patients to the heated recovery area. "Shared near-death experiences can create powerful psychological bonds, even between species." But the deliberate nature of his gestures, the apparent emotional intelligence he's displaying, I've never seen anything like it. Word of the rescue spread faster than the floodwaters that had triggered it. Miguel's video, posted to TikTok with the caption, "Lion thanks man who saved him. You won't believe what happens next," garnered 3 million views in the first 6 hours. Facebook shares exploded across military veteran groups, animal rescue organizations, and local Texas community pages. The comments section became a battlefield of opinions. Animal rights activists praised Bill's heroism while questioning the ethics of keeping wild animals in captivity. Religious groups saw divine intervention in the lion's behavior. Scientists demanded more documentation and analysis. But the most telling responses came from other veterans who recognized something in Bill's story that civilians might miss. They understood the look in his eyes during the interviews, the haunted expression of a man who'd lost everything and found salvation in the most unexpected place. "That lion sees what we all see," wrote one commenter who identified himself as a Marine veteran, "a good man who's been carrying too much weight for too long." Sometimes it takes another broken soul to recognize your worth when you can't see it yourself. As night fell and the floodwaters began to recede, courage refused to leave Bill's side. The staff set up a cot in the quarantine building so the two could remain together while both recovered from their ordeal. Every few hours, Courage would lift his massive head to check on his sleeping companion, then settle back into his protective position. "This changes everything," Maggie confided to Dr. Mitchell as they watched the impossible pair through the observation window. "The bond they've formed, it's like nothing I've ever seen in 3 decades of animal rescue. It challenges our fundamental understanding of predator psychology," Dr. Mitchell agreed. "We'll need to document everything carefully. The scientific community needs to see this." Neither woman could have predicted how prophetic those words would prove to be. By morning, the story would have reached national news outlets, bringing attention the sanctuary had never imagined, along with complications no one could have foreseen. But for now, in the quiet hours after the storm, man and lion slept side by side, two broken souls who'd found something in each other that the world had convinced them no longer existed, the possibility of trust, connection, and perhaps even healing. The real story, however, was just beginning. The viral video changed everything overnight. Bill woke to find his phone buzzing with notifications from numbers he didn't recognize, reporters calling the sanctuary's main line, and news vans already gathering at the front gate. Miguel's footage had exploded across every social media platform, accumulating 15 million views in 24 hours and spawning hundreds of reaction videos from animal behaviorists, celebrities, and ordinary people moved by the extraordinary bond they'd witnessed. "Good Morning America wants an exclusive interview," Maggie announced, scrolling through the dozens of media requests that had flooded their email. So does CNN, Fox News, and something called the Ellen DeGeneres Show. I don't even know who half these people are. Bill groaned, pulling his blanket higher as Courage lifted his massive head to investigate the commotion. The lion had barely left his side since the rescue, taking meals in the quarantine building and sleeping curled against Bill's cot like an enormous deadly house cat. "I didn't sign up for this circus, Maggie. I just wanted to help the animals." "Well, help is exactly what we're getting," she replied, brandishing a printed email. "The GoFundMe that Miguel set up last night has already raised $200,000. $200,000, Bill. That's enough to keep us operating for another year." The money was desperately needed. Before the flood and the viral video, the Lone Star Wildlife Sanctuary had been hemorrhaging funds at an alarming rate. Insurance companies refused to cover exotic animals, veterinary bills were astronomical, and public donations had dwindled as the economy tightened. Maggie had been privately preparing to close the facility within 6 months, though she'd never admitted it to the volunteers. Now, suddenly, they were inundated with support from around the world. Donations poured in from as far away as Japan and Norway, accompanied by heartfelt messages from people who saw something profound in the connection between the old veteran and the broken lion. The sanctuary's website crashed twice under the traffic load, and their phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. But with the attention came scrutiny that made Bill increasingly uncomfortable. Animal rights organizations began questioning the ethics of the sanctuary's practices. The Humane Society issued a carefully worded statement about the complex dynamics of human-wildlife interaction. PETA launched a social media campaign demanding that Courage be transferred to a species-appropriate facility away from human contact. "They're saying we're exploiting him," Bill said, reading the comments on his phone while Courage dozed against his legs. "That the bond isn't real, that we're anthropomorphizing normal animal behavior for publicity." Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent 3 days documenting and analyzing Courage's behavior, taking detailed notes and consulting with colleagues across the country. Her preliminary findings were both fascinating and troubling from a scientific perspective. "The attachment is absolutely genuine," she explained during an emergency meeting with the sanctuary's board of directors. "This isn't learned behavior or conditioning. Courage is displaying protective instincts typically reserved for pride members or offspring. He's treating Bill as family, which should be impossible given his traumatic history with humans." The implications were staggering. If a severely abused lion could form this kind of bond with a human, it challenged fundamental assumptions about animal psychology, trauma recovery, and the possibility of interspecies emotional connections. Universities began reaching out, requesting permission to study Courage and Bill's relationship. Netflix inquired about documentary rights. "This is bigger than just our sanctuary," Maggie realized. "This could change how we understand animal consciousness, emotional intelligence, maybe even the healing process itself." But the growing attention also brought unwanted complications. Protesters gathered outside the sanctuary gates, split between those who saw Bill as a hero and those who viewed him as an animal exploiter. Death threats arrived via email from extremists on both sides of the animal rights debate. Local law enforcement recommended increased security measures. The stress was taking its toll on Bill, whose health had been fragile even before the water rescue. The chest pains that had plagued him since Martha's death were getting worse, though he refused to see a doctor. At 68, he'd buried his wife and son. He wasn't about to abandon Courage for what he dismissed as a little heart trouble. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Maggie warned, watching him work 16-hour days to avoid the media circus outside. "This attention isn't going to die down overnight. You need to pace yourself." But Bill couldn't rest, not with Courage depending on him. The lion's anxiety spiked whenever Bill left his sight, even for basic necessities. During feeding times, Courage would pace restlessly until Bill returned, refusing to eat until his chosen human was present. The attachment that had seemed miraculous during the rescue was becoming a complex challenge that none of them had anticipated. 3 weeks after the viral video, their fragile new equilibrium was shattered by an unexpected visitor. Richard Blackwood arrived on a Tuesday morning with a briefcase full of legal documents and an expression that promised trouble. Tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and cold blue eyes, he carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation and legal maneuvering. "I'm here about the lion," he announced without preamble, spreading papers across Maggie's desk with practiced efficiency. "Specifically about its illegal appropriation from my property." The documents told a story that made Maggie's blood run cold. According to Richard's paperwork, Courage had been purchased legally from the bankrupt Hermanos Circus in Mexico 6 months ago, the same transaction that had brought the lion to their sanctuary. But while Maggie had believed she was participating in a legitimate rescue operation, Richard claimed the animal had been stolen from his private collection during transport. "This is impossible," Maggie protested, scanning the bills of sale and transfer documents. "We have our own paperwork showing legal acquisition." The circus owner, Manuel Hernandez, signed everything over to us. Manuel Hernandez didn't own that lion, Richard replied coldly. He was transporting it on my behalf when your people intercepted the shipment. I have proof of purchase, import permits, and documentation showing clear ownership. That animal belongs to me. The legal nightmare that followed consumed the next month. Lawyers, court hearings, and depositions became a constant presence in their lives. Richard's claim appeared legitimate on paper. He owned a private exotic animal facility in East Texas and had documentation supporting his version of events. The fact that his facility was later revealed to be a high-fence hunting preserve that catered to wealthy clients seeking trophy kills was legally irrelevant. Bill watched the proceedings with growing despair. The bond he'd formed with Courage was being reduced to property disputes and ownership claims, as if the lion were nothing more than a valuable asset to be transferred between facilities. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 40 years in the military fighting for freedom, only to see his closest companion treated as chattel by a legal system that recognized no emotional bonds between species. "We'll fight this," Maggie promised, though her own lawyers were pessimistic about their chances. "Public opinion is on our side. The viral video shows what you and Courage mean to each other." But public opinion carried no weight in court. Richard's documentation was thorough and appeared legitimate, while their own paperwork contained enough ambiguities to raise questions about the original transfer. Worse still, Richard had the financial resources to sustain a lengthy legal battle that would bankrupt the sanctuary long before reaching a verdict. The stress was affecting Courage as much as Bill. The lion could sense the tension surrounding the legal proceedings, becoming increasingly agitated whenever strangers appeared at the sanctuary. His eating patterns became erratic, and he began displaying self-destructive behaviors that reminded Dr. Mitchell of his early days after the circus rescue. "This is exactly what happened before," she warned during one of her regular examinations. "Legal battles, custody disputes, uncertainty about his future, it's triggering his trauma responses. If this continues much longer, we could see complete psychological regression." Bill knew she was right. He could see it in Courage's eyes, the same hollow desperation that had marked his early days at the sanctuary. The progress they'd made together was unraveling with each court filing, each legal maneuver that treated their bond as irrelevant to the proceedings. The breaking point came during a mandatory court-ordered evaluation of Courage's living conditions. Richard arrived with his own veterinarian and a court-appointed animal welfare specialist to assess whether the sanctuary was providing adequate care. The inspection itself was routine, but Richard's presence sent Courage into a panic attack so severe that Dr. Mitchell had to sedate him. "This animal is clearly suffering from separation anxiety and inappropriate human attachment," Richard's veterinarian concluded in his report. "Professional management in a controlled environment would be more beneficial than this emotional codependency." Reading those words felt like a physical blow to Bill. 40 years of military service, decades of caring for wounded animals, and now some stranger was dismissing the most meaningful relationship of his life as inappropriate codependency. The chest pains that had been his constant companion since Martha's death intensified, spreading down his left arm with an urgency that he could no longer ignore. "Bill?" Maggie's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Bill, you need to sit down. You don't look good." But Bill was already falling, the sanctuary office tilting sideways as his heart struggled to pump blood through arteries narrowed by stress, grief, and 68 years of hard living. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Courage's face pressed against the office window, the lion's one good eye wide with an emotion that looked disturbingly like human panic. The heart attack was massive, the kind that killed more men Bill's age than all the wars he'd survived combined. As paramedics worked to stabilize him for transport to Austin General Hospital, Courage's roars echoed across the sanctuary grounds, not the threatening sounds of an apex predator, but the heartbroken cries of a creature watching his world collapse for the second time in his life. "He knows," Dr. Mitchell whispered to Maggie as they watched the ambulance disappear down the gravel road. "Somehow, that lion knows exactly what's happening." What none of them could have predicted was how Richard Blackwood would react to seeing his legal victory potentially rendered meaningless by an old man's failing heart. For the first time since arriving at the sanctuary, the cold certainty in his eyes flickered with something that might have been doubt. The real battle for Courage's future was about to begin, and it would reveal truths that none of them were prepared to face. The Cardiac Intensive Care Unit at Austin General Hospital had never hosted a lion before, but that didn't stop Courage from trying to reach his fallen companion. For 3 days, the big cat paced the perimeter of the sanctuary's quarantine building, his one good eye fixed on the road that had taken Bill away. He refused all food, ignored the other volunteers, and filled the Texas Hill Country with the most heartbroken sounds any of them had ever heard from a wild animal. "It's like he's mourning," Dr. Mitchell observed, watching Courage through the observation window as he lay in the exact spot where Bill's cot had been positioned. This level of emotional response, it challenges everything we thought we knew about feline psychology. Maggie hadn't slept since the ambulance departed. Between coordinating Bill's medical care, managing the media frenzy that had exploded around his hospitalization, and trying to keep the sanctuary operational, she was running on coffee and sheer determination. The legal battle with Richard Blackwood had been temporarily suspended due to Bill's condition, but she knew it was only a reprieve. "The doctors aren't optimistic," she reported to the gathered volunteers, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Bill's suffered massive damage to his heart muscle. Even if he survives, they're talking about months of rehabilitation, possible surgery. He's not a young man." The implications hung heavy in the air. Without Bill, Courage was reverting to the traumatized, withdrawn creature they'd first rescued from the Mexican circus. The progress of months was unraveling in days, and no amount of professional intervention seemed to help. Other volunteers tried to comfort the lion, but he remained inconsolable, lost in a grief that transcended species barriers. Miguel, who had filmed the original rescue video, found himself documenting a very different story now. His updates showed Courage's decline in heartbreaking detail, the magnificent predator reduced to a shadow of himself, lying motionless for hours at a time, his golden coat losing its luster as he refused all sustenance. "This is what happens when you form unnatural attachments," Richard Blackwood told a reporter from the Austin American-Statesman, his voice carrying a mixture of vindication and something that might have been regret. "Wild animals aren't meant to bond with humans. This lion's suffering proves that keeping him here was a mistake from the beginning." But Richard's confident demeanor cracked when he visited the sanctuary to check on his property pending the court's final decision. Seeing Courage's condition firsthand, the listless giant who barely acknowledged his presence seemed to affect him more than he'd anticipated. "How long has he been like this?" Richard asked Maggie, his usual arrogance replaced by something resembling concern. "Since the moment Bill collapsed," she replied, not bothering to hide her hostility. 3 days without food, barely any water. He's dying of a broken heart, if you believe such things are possible." Richard stared at the lion for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were struggling with words that wouldn't come. Finally he asked, "What did the old man mean to him?" "Everything," Maggie said simply. "Bill saved his life. But more than that, he gave him back his ability to trust, to love. You're looking at what happens when that gets torn away." The conversation was interrupted by Maggie's phone buzzing with yet another call from the hospital. Bill had developed pneumonia, a common but dangerous complication for heart attack patients his age. His condition had deteriorated overnight, and the doctors were asking about end-of-life preferences and next-of-kin notifications. He doesn't have anyone, Maggie realized with a crushing sense of helplessness. His wife died 2 years ago. His son was killed in Afghanistan. We're the closest thing to family he has left. The media attention that had initially brought hope and funding to the sanctuary now felt like a circus of exploitation. News crews camped outside the hospital, trying to get updates on Bill's condition. Social media exploded with theories about the mystical bond between man and lion, while animal rights activists used the situation to advance their own agendas. Dr. Patricia Williamson, a renowned animal behaviorist from Texas A&M University, arrived on the 4th day to document what she termed an unprecedented case of interspecies grief response. Her preliminary observations confirmed what everyone at the sanctuary already knew. Courage was exhibiting behaviors typically seen only in highly social mammals like elephants or dolphins. The depth of his distress suggests cognitive and emotional complexity that we've historically attributed only to humans and our closest evolutionary relatives, she explained to the gathered researchers and media representatives. If these observations are accurate, we may need to fundamentally reconsider our understanding of animal consciousness. But academic interest felt coldly irrelevant to Maggie as she watched courage waste away. The lion had lost nearly 30 pounds in less than a week, his once powerful frame becoming gaunt and fragile. Dr. Mitchell warned that they were approaching the point where forced intervention might be necessary to save his life. We could try intravenous feeding, she suggested during an emergency consultation, but it would require heavy sedation, and given his psychological state, that might cause more trauma than benefit. The decision was taken out of their hands when Courage collapsed during his 6th day without food. The big cat simply lay down in his usual spot and didn't get up, his breathing becoming shallow and labored as his body began shutting down. Dr. Mitchell's emergency treatment stabilized him temporarily, but the message was clear. Without Bill, Courage was choosing to die. "This is insane," Richard Blackwood muttered, watching the veterinary team work to save the lion he'd been fighting to claim. "It's just an animal. Animals don't commit suicide over emotional attachments." But even as he spoke the words, Richard's voice lacked conviction. Something about Courage's obvious suffering was affecting him in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. For the first time since beginning his legal campaign, he found himself questioning whether ownership rights were more important than the bond he was witnessing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Bill's cardiologist at Austin General, had been following the media coverage of Courage's decline with professional interest. As both a physician and a longtime supporter of animal-assisted therapy programs, she understood the healing power of human-animal bonds better than most. "I have an idea," she told Maggie during one of their daily check-ins about Bill's condition. "It's unconventional, probably against hospital policy, and definitely not something I've ever tried before. But given the circumstances—" She paused, seeming to weigh the professional risks against the potential benefits. "What if we brought them together?" Just once, under controlled conditions, Bill's conscious now, though weak. Maybe seeing Courage would give him the motivation to fight harder for recovery. And maybe seeing Bill would keep Courage from giving up entirely, Maggie finished, understanding immediately. "But the logistics—" "Leave that to me," Dr. Walsh said with the confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years navigating hospital bureaucracy. "I know people who owe me favors. If we can document this as a therapeutic intervention—" The plan that emerged was elaborate and risky. Courage would be transported to the hospital in a specialized veterinary ambulance, accompanied by Dr. Mitchell and a full medical team. The meeting would take place in the hospital's loading dock area, away from other patients but accessible to both cardiac and veterinary emergency equipment. "If either of them shows signs of distress, we separate them immediately," Dr. Walsh insisted. Bill's heart can't handle any additional stress, and Courage is already in critical condition. Richard Blackwood could have stopped the entire plan with a single legal injunction. As the lion's claimed owner, he had the right to deny any medical intervention not directly related to preserving the animal's life. But when Maggie approached him for permission, something in his expression had changed. "You really think this will help them?" he asked, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "I think it's their only chance," Maggie replied honestly. "Bill's lost the will to fight, and Courage is dying of heartbreak. Maybe together they can find a reason to live." Richard stared at the legal documents spread across his lawyer's desk, papers that would make him the undisputed owner of a lion worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Wright Hunting Preserve. Then he thought about Courage's empty eyes, the way the magnificent predator had simply given up when Bill disappeared. "Do it," he said quietly. "But I want to be there. I need to see this for myself." The reunion was scheduled for early morning, when the hospital would be at its quietest. As dawn broke over Austin, a convoy of vehicles made its way toward Austin General Hospital, the veterinary ambulance carrying a sedated but stable Courage, followed by cars full of medical personnel, researchers, and media representatives who had been granted limited access to document what many believed could be a pivotal moment in our understanding of animal consciousness. None of them were prepared for what happened when Courage first caught sight of Bill through the ambulance's rear window. The lion's reaction was immediate and profound, a transformation from listless despair to urgent, desperate hope that left everyone present struggling to maintain their scientific objectivity. The real test would come when the doors opened and two broken souls saw each other clearly for the first time in a week that had felt like a lifetime. The loading dock of Austin General Hospital had been transformed into an impromptu medical theater, with cardiac monitors, veterinary equipment, and enough cameras to document what Dr. Walsh privately believed might be either a miracle or a disaster. Bill Henderson lay on a transport gurney, connected to a portable heart monitor that beeped with the irregular rhythm of a damaged organ fighting to keep its owner alive. At 68, after a massive heart attack and subsequent pneumonia, he looked every day of his age and then some. "Are you sure about this, Bill?" Dr. Walsh asked one final time, checking his vital signs on the portable monitor. "Your heart is still very fragile. Any emotional shock could trigger another episode." Bill's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the ventilator tube that had only been removed the day before. "Doc, if seeing Courage kills me, at least I'll die happy." "And if it doesn't, maybe we'll both find a reason to keep fighting." The veterinary ambulance doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and Dr. Mitchell emerged first, followed by two technicians guiding a wheeled transport cage. Through the bars, Courage was barely recognizable as the magnificent predator who had once commanded respect through sheer presence. 7 days without proper nutrition had left him gaunt and weak, his golden coat dull and lifeless. But the moment he caught sight of Bill across the loading dock, something electric passed through his emaciated frame. The sound Courage made defied every scientific classification of lion vocalizations. It wasn't a roar, wasn't the soft chuffing that indicated contentment, but something entirely new, a keening cry that seemed to encompass relief, joy, and desperate longing all at once. Every person present felt their throat tighten at the raw emotion in that sound. "Jesus," Richard Blackwood muttered, his hands clenched into fists as he watched from the edge of the gathering. "I've never heard anything like that from any animal." Bill tried to sit up on the gurney, his heart monitor immediately protesting with rapid beeping as his pulse spiked dangerously high. "Easy there, soldier," he called out, using the same calm tone that had worked during their water rescue. "I'm here. I'm okay." Dr. Mitchell opened the transport cage with practiced caution, but her precautions proved unnecessary. Courage emerged slowly, his movements careful and deliberate rather than predatory. He approached Bill's gurney with what could only be described as reverence, his one good eye never leaving the old man's face. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Williamson whispered into her recording device, documenting every nuance of behavior for future analysis. The level of emotional intelligence, the controlled response despite obvious distress, it challenges fundamental assumptions about predator psychology. When Courage reached the gurney, he did something that brought tears to the eyes of hardened medical professionals and researchers alike. The massive lion carefully placed his head on Bill's chest, positioning himself so that he could feel the old man's heartbeat without putting pressure on the surgical incisions. Then he simply lay still, his own breathing synchronizing with Bill's as if he were consciously trying to share his strength. "Well, I'll be damned," Bill whispered, his weathered hand finding the soft fur behind Courage's ears. "You waited for me, didn't you, big guy? Even when everyone said you should give up, you waited." The heart monitor's beeping began to steady as Bill's pulse regulated, the arrhythmia that had plagued him since the attack smoothing into a more normal rhythm. "Doctor." Walsh checked the readings twice, unable to believe what the instruments were telling her. "His cardiac function is actually improving," she announced to the gathered medical team. "Blood pressure stabilizing, heart rate normalizing. I've never seen anything like this in 40 years of cardiology." But the real miracle was happening with Courage. As he felt Bill's steady heartbeat beneath his head, the lion began to show signs of recovery that had eluded weeks of veterinary intervention. His breathing deepened, his muscles relaxed from the tension that had gripped him since Bill's collapse, and for the first time in 7 days, he closed his eyes and seemed truly at peace. "They're healing each other," Maggie observed, her voice thick with emotion as she filmed the reunion on her phone. "Bill's heart is responding to Courage's presence, and Courage is responding to Bill's." Richard Blackwood stood apart from the group, his expression unreadable as he watched the two beings who had somehow found in each other what the rest of the world had failed to provide. His legal claim to Courage had never seemed more hollow than it did in this moment, watching a bond that transcended any human concept of ownership. 20 minutes into the reunion, Dr. Walsh made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "I'm admitting them both," she announced. "Bill needs extended cardiac care, and separating them now could be catastrophic for both patients." "You can't bring a lion into a hospital," protested Dr. Robert Stevens, the chief of staff, who had arrived to assess the situation. "The liability issues alone." "Watch me, Doctor." Walsh replied with the confidence of someone who had just witnessed something that would redefine her understanding of medicine. "We'll set up a controlled environment in the rehabilitation wing. Full medical monitoring for both patients, security protocols in place. This is therapeutic intervention at its most basic level." The improvised medical facility that emerged over the next 24 hours became a testament to human ingenuity and compassion. A section of the hospital's physical therapy wing was converted into a specialized care unit, with Bill's cardiac equipment positioned alongside veterinary monitoring systems for Courage. The walls were lined with cameras to document every aspect of their recovery, while medical teams from both human and veterinary disciplines worked together in unprecedented collaboration. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Bill's recovery accelerated dramatically with Courage beside him, his damaged heart showing improvement that his cardiologist described as medically improbable. The old veteran began eating regularly, engaging with his physical therapy, and showing a will to live that had been absent since his wife's death. Courage's transformation was equally remarkable. With Bill's steady presence, the lion began accepting food again, his weight stabilizing and then increasing as proper nutrition restored his strength. The self-destructive behaviors that had marked his early days at the sanctuary disappeared entirely, replaced by a calm attentiveness to his chosen human's needs. "It's like they're sharing the healing process," Dr. Mitchell explained to a group of veterinary students who had come to observe this unique case. Courage monitors Bill's breathing patterns, becomes agitated if the heart monitor shows irregularities, even positions himself to provide physical support during therapy sessions. The media attention was unprecedented. Major networks carried daily updates on the miracle recovery taking place at Austin General. Social media exploded with hashtags like #Courage and Bill and #Healing Together. The story transcended typical animal interest pieces, becoming a symbol of hope and connection in a world that often seemed divided by differences. But not everyone was celebrating. Animal rights extremists protested outside the hospital, arguing that keeping a wild predator in a medical facility was exploitative and dangerous. "This is a publicity stunt," declared Rebecca Morrison from People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals during a televised interview. "That lion belongs in a proper sanctuary, not being used as emotional support for one old man." The criticism stung, particularly because it echoed Richard Blackwood's original arguments about appropriate animal care. But the medical evidence was undeniable. Both patients were thriving in ways that traditional treatment had failed to achieve. Dr. Williamson's preliminary research findings, published in the Journal of Comparative Psychology, documented behavioral patterns that challenged established theories about animal consciousness and emotional capacity. "What we're observing suggests that certain species may be capable of empathetic responses previously thought to be uniquely human," she wrote. "The therapeutic implications could revolutionize both human and veterinary medicine." 3 weeks into their shared recovery, Bill was strong enough to walk short distances with Courage at his side. The lion had learned to match his pace to Bill's slower gait, providing physical support when the old man tired and serving as an early warning system for medical episodes that hospital equipment might miss. "He knows when I'm having trouble before I do," Bill told Dr. Walsh during one of his daily cardiac evaluations. "Yesterday he started acting agitated about 10 minutes before my blood pressure spiked. It's like he can sense changes in my body chemistry." The bond had evolved beyond simple attachment into something approaching medical partnership. Courage had become, in effect, a living diagnostic tool whose presence seemed to regulate Bill's cardiac function in ways that medication alone couldn't achieve. But their peaceful recovery was about to be shattered by a revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about each other, about family, and about the connections that bind us across the deepest divides. The truth was hidden in a manila envelope that Richard Blackwood carried with shaking hands as he approached the hospital room where his legal adversaries had found the healing that had eluded him for 45 years. Richard Blackwood stood outside the improvised hospital room for 20 minutes before finding the courage to knock. Through the observation window, he could see Bill Henderson reading aloud from what appeared to be a worn paperback novel, while Courage lay beside the hospital bed, his massive head resting on the mattress near the old man's hand. The scene was so peaceful, so achingly domestic, that it made Richard's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The manila envelope in his hands contained documents that would destroy this tranquil moment forever. DNA test results, birth certificates, military records, papers that told a story so improbable that Richard had spent 3 sleepless nights verifying and re-verifying the information. The truth he'd discovered would shatter everything they thought they knew about each other. "Come in," Bill called when Richard finally knocked, his voice stronger than it had been since the heart attack, but still carrying the fragility of a man who'd walked close to death. Courage lifted his head alertly, his one good eye fixing on Richard with the wariness of a predator who sensed a threat to his pack. "Mr. Henderson," Richard began, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. "How do you tell a man that the son he mourned The boy he'd raised and loved and buried was your biological child. How do you explain that the legal battle you'd waged was actually a fight between a father and grandfather over a lion who represented their shared loss? "Spit it out, son," Bill said, with the directness of a man who'd delivered bad news in field hospitals from Vietnam to Afghanistan. "Whatever's eating at you, it's not going to get easier by dancing around it." Richard sat heavily in the visitor's chair, the manila envelope crinkling in his hands. "Before I tell you this, I need you to know that I had no idea. None of this was intentional. If I'd known—" "Known what?" Bill's heart monitor began beeping faster, responding to the stress in his voice. Courage immediately shifted position, placing his massive paw on Bill's chest in a gesture that had become their established calming routine. "James Henderson wasn't your biological son," Richard said quietly, the words falling like stones into still water. "He was mine." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady beeping of medical equipment and Courage's soft breathing. Bill stared at Richard with an expression that cycled through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been recognition. "That's impossible," Bill whispered, but even as he spoke, his military mind was already processing the implications. The timing would work. Martha had briefly dated someone else before they met, a relationship she'd described as a mistake that ended badly. She'd been 3 months pregnant when they married, but Bill had never questioned the timeline. Richard opened the envelope with trembling hands, spreading documents across the bedside table. Birth certificates, DNA comparisons, military service records, all painting a picture that neither man wanted to accept. "I was 18 when I met your wife," Richard continued, his voice barely audible. "It was 1978. I was working construction in San Antonio. She was in nursing school. We dated for about 6 months before I got arrested for some stupid stuff I'm not proud of. When I got out of jail, she was gone. I never knew she was pregnant." Bill picked up James's birth certificate with shaking hands, seeing details he'd never paid attention to before. The careful alteration of dates, the way Martha's maiden name was written in different ink. "She never told me," he said, his voice breaking. "In 37 years of marriage, she never said a word." "She probably thought she was protecting all of us," Richard offered, though the words felt inadequate against the magnitude of what they were facing. "My arrest record, the kind of man I was then. Maybe she figured James was better off without knowing." The revelation recontextualized everything. Richard's hostility toward Bill, his determination to claim Courage, even his visceral reaction to seeing the bond between man and lion. He hadn't been fighting for ownership of an animal. He'd been fighting his son's adoptive father for custody of the only living connection to the boy he'd never known existed. "He died believing I was his father," Bill said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "And I was, in every way that mattered. I taught him to ride a bike, helped with homework, walked him to school on his first day. I was there when he graduated from high school, when he enlisted, when he—" The sentence hung unfinished between them, heavy with the weight of shared loss. Richard's own eyes were wet as he pulled out a worn photograph, a young soldier in desert camouflage, the same crooked smile that Bill remembered from countless family pictures. "I got this from his unit commander," Richard said quietly. "After I found out about everything. Staff Sergeant James Henderson, killed by an IED outside Kandahar on March 15, 2019. They told me he was trying to protect a convoy of Afghan children when it happened." "That sounds like him," Bill whispered, his hand automatically stroking Courage's fur for comfort. Even as a kid, he couldn't stand to see anyone get hurt. Martha used to say he had too much heart for his own good. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Both men had lost the same boy, one as an adoptive father who'd poured his life into raising him, the other as a biological father who'd never had the chance to know him existed. Their grief was a mirror reflecting the same devastating loss from different angles. "Why courage?" Bill asked suddenly, looking at Richard with new understanding. "Why fight so hard for a lion you'd never met?" Richard's composure finally cracked completely. "Because when I saw that video of you two together, it reminded me of how James looked in the pictures his unit sent me. The same protective instinct, the same gentle strength. That lion was the closest I could get to my son, and you—" He paused, struggling with the words. "You were the man who got to be his father when I couldn't." Dr. Walsh chose that moment to enter for Bill's evening cardiac check, stopping short when she saw both men crying while Courage watched with obvious concern. The lion had positioned himself between them, as if sensing the emotional turbulence and trying to provide comfort to both humans simultaneously. "Should I come back later?" she asked gently, recognizing a profound moment when she saw one. "No," Bill said, wiping his eyes and gesturing for her to continue. "Doc, I'd like you to meet James's biological father. Richard, this is Dr. Walsh, the woman who saved my life so I could meet my grandson's grandfather." The absurdity of the relationship labels brought a weak smile to Richard's face. "I don't even know what to call you," he admitted. "In-law doesn't seem right. Stepfather feels wrong. We're connected by a son neither of us can hold anymore." "How about we start with family?" Bill suggested, extending his hand to the man who'd been his legal adversary just hours before. James would have wanted his fathers to know each other. Richard clasped Bill's hand, and Courage responded by placing his massive paw over both their joined hands, an impossible gesture that seemed to seal their new understanding. The lion who had brought them together in conflict was now witnessing their reconciliation, as if he understood that his role in their lives was larger than anyone had imagined. "I'm dropping all legal claims to Courage," Richard said quietly. "He belongs with you, just like James did. But I'd like to visit sometimes, if that's okay. To hear stories about my son, to learn about the man he became." "He became someone you would have been proud of," Bill replied, his voice steady despite the tears still flowing. "And I think he'd want his biological father to know the lion who helped his old man heal." As if summoned by their words, Courage shifted to lie across both men's feet, a living bridge connecting two broken hearts that had finally found each other through shared loss and unexpected grace. The legal battle was over, but their real relationship as family was just beginning. Outside, the sun was setting over Austin, painting the hospital room in golden light that seemed to bless this most unlikely of reconciliations. Three beings who had lost everything had somehow found each other, proving that sometimes the deepest connections are forged not in joy, but in the ashes of shared sorrow. 2 years later, Bill Henderson stood at the observation deck of the newly constructed James Henderson Memorial Wing of the Lone Star Wildlife Sanctuary, watching Courage lead a group of special needs children through their afternoon therapy session. At 70, his heart bore the scars of that near-fatal attack, but his spirit had found a peace he'd never thought possible after losing Martha and James. "He's a natural with the kids," Richard observed, joining Bill at the window with 2 cups of coffee, their daily ritual since he'd moved to Austin and become the sanctuary's primary benefactor. "Look how gentle he is with that little girl." Below them, 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who hadn't spoken since witnessing her father's death in a car accident, sat quietly brushing Courage's mane while the massive lion lay perfectly still. The therapy program, pioneered by Dr. Mitchell and funded by donations that had poured in after their story went viral, had helped dozens of traumatized children find their voices again through connections with rescued animals. "James would have loved this," Bill said softly, touching the memorial plaque that bore his son's photograph in full military dress. "He always said the best healing happens when broken souls help other broken souls." The sanctuary had transformed beyond recognition since that flood-filled morning when everything changed. Corporate sponsorships, celebrity endorsements, and a Netflix documentary had brought financial stability they'd never dreamed possible. More importantly, the research being conducted here was revolutionizing understanding of animal-assisted therapy and interspecies emotional bonds. Dr. Williamson's groundbreaking study, Courage and Bill, a case study in cross-species therapeutic attachment, had been published in 3 major scientific journals and was being used to develop new treatment protocols for PTSD patients worldwide. The video of their reunion at the hospital had become required viewing in veterinary and medical schools across the country. "Grandpa Bill," called out Marcus, a 7-year-old who'd been mute since his rescue from an abusive home. Courage had somehow coaxed the boy's first words in 2 years during their 3rd session together. "Courage wants to know if you're coming down for story time." "How can you tell what Courage wants?" Bill asked, playing along with the game that had become a beloved routine. "He told me with his eyes," Marcus replied solemnly. "Just like you taught me. Animals talk with their hearts, not their mouths." Richard chuckled, still amazed by the transformation in both Bill and the lion who'd brought them together. "I never thought I'd see the day when a combat veteran and a circus-traumatized lion would become pediatric therapists." "Life has a funny way of putting us where we need to be," Bill replied, making his way toward the stairs. "Even when we think we're lost, sometimes we're exactly where we're supposed to end up." As they descended to join the therapy session, Bill reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The legal battle that had nearly destroyed them had instead revealed the family connections that made them whole. Richard had found the son he'd never known in the stories Bill shared about James, while Bill had discovered that love didn't diminish when shared. It multiplied. Courage looked up as Bill approached, his one good eye bright with the contentment of a creature who'd found his purpose. The lion who'd once cowered in the corner of a cage now served as a beacon of hope for children who'd lost their way in the darkness of trauma. "All right, everyone," Bill announced, settling into his favorite chair as Courage positioned himself at his feet. "Who wants to hear about the time your friend Courage taught an old soldier that heroes come in all shapes and sizes?" The children gathered around eagerly, their faces glowing with the particular magic that happened when love transcended every boundary that seemed to separate us. In the golden light of a Texas afternoon, 3 generations, a grandfather, a father, and their shared lion, continued the work of healing that had begun with a simple act of courage in dark, rising water. Sometimes salvation arrives not as we expect it, but exactly as we need it. With 4 legs, 1 good eye, and a heart large enough to hold all the love the world tries to convince us is impossible. At 68, Bill Henderson thought his story was over, another widowed veteran facing empty days in an empty house, carrying the weight of losing both his beloved Martha and his son James in Afghanistan. Like so many of us who've reached this season of life, he'd convinced himself that his best years were behind him, that purpose and joy were luxuries for the young. But sometimes life has other plans. When Bill pulled that broken lion from rising floodwater, he wasn't just saving Courage, he was discovering that our capacity for love, for meaning, for making a difference, doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. The bond between this grieving veteran and traumatized lion became a beacon of hope for children who'd lost their voices, proving that our scars don't disqualify us from service, they qualify us for it. Bill's story reminds us that family isn't always blood, that healing often comes through helping others heal, and that at any age we can find connections that transform not just our own lives, but the lives of those around us. Your next chapter might be your most important one yet. Discussion questions. What unexpected connections have brought healing into your life during challenging seasons? How might your own experiences of loss or difficulty position you to help others find hope? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.